Living in a quaint cottage near the edge of a vast, dense forest, Mark and Ella led a life that seemed idyllic on the surface. Mark, a rugged forester, spent his days amidst the trees, finding solace in nature. Ella, on the other hand, managed their home and worked part-time at a nearby cafe. They were just starting to talk about having children, envisioning a future filled with laughter and little feet running around their cozy home. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast long shadows across their yard, Ella noticed something different about Mark. He seemed distracted, his eyes distant and filled with a quiet intensity she hadn't seen before. He was often evasive, muttering vague excuses when she asked about his day. "Mark, is everything okay?" she asked, trying to catch his eye as he sat at the kitchen table, staring at the wall. "Yeah, just tired," he replied, avoiding her gaze. "The forest takes a lot out of me." Ella nodded, though she wasn't convinced. Something was off, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something from her. The following morning, Mark prepared to head into the forest as usual. "I'm going to gather some firewood," he said, grabbing his axe and a small backpack. "I'll be back by evening." "Be careful," Ella called after him, her voice tinged with worry. As the hours passed, Ella busied herself with household chores, trying to keep her mind off her unease. When evening came and Mark hadn't returned, she began to worry. She called his name into the darkness, her voice echoing through the trees, but there was no response. Panic set in as night fell and Mark was still nowhere to be seen. She spent a sleepless night pacing the house, her heart pounding with fear. When dawn broke, Ella decided she couldn't wait any longer. She had to find him. Grabbing a flashlight and bundling up against the morning chill, Ella ventured into the forest. The tall trees loomed over her, casting eerie shadows on the ground. She called out for Mark repeatedly, but the only response was the rustling of leaves in the wind. After hours of searching, she stumbled back home, exhausted and scared. She knew she needed help. Trembling, she picked up the phone and called her friend Alex, whom she had grown close to in recent months. "Alex, it's Mark. He's missing," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't know what to do." "I'll be right there," Alex replied, concern evident in his voice. True to his word, Alex arrived at the cottage within the hour. He found Ella pacing frantically, tears streaming down her face. "We need to call the police," Alex said firmly. "They'll know what to do." Ella nodded, her hands shaking as she dialed the number. She explained the situation to the operator, her voice wavering with each word. Within a short time, a police search was organized and officers began scouring the forest, calling out Mark's name. As the search continued, Ella's guilt and fear grew. She couldn't help but feel responsible for everything. She had been growing closer to Alex, and now Mark was missing. Her heart ached with a mixture of dread and remorse. The sun was beginning to set again, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Ella and Alex sat on the porch waiting for any news from the search party. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken fears and regrets. "You'll find him," Alex said, attempting to comfort her. "Mark's tough. He'll be okay." Ella nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened. As the second night approached, her mind raced with worst-case scenarios. She replayed every conversation, every moment over the past few weeks, trying to find a clue that could explain Mark's disappearance. It was around midnight when Ella heard a noise outside. She and Alex exchanged worried glances before stepping out onto the porch. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged. It wasn't Mark. The search team leader approached, his face grim. "We haven't found him yet, but we're not giving up," he said. "We'll continue searching at first light." Ella felt a lump in her throat. She thanked the officer and watched as he walked back to his team. The night stretched on, each minute feeling like an eternity. She was filled with a mixture of hope and dread, wondering if Mark was still out there, and if he was, what condition he might be in. As dawn broke on the second day of the search, Ella stood at the edge of the forest, determination in her eyes. She knew she had to keep going, for Mark's sake and for her own. The forest held its secrets tightly, but she was resolved to uncover them and bring Mark back home. Little did she know the truth about Mark's disappearance and the dark secrets that lay hidden would change their lives forever. The second day of Mark's disappearance dawned with a heavy fog hanging over the forest. Ella's eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, her nerves frayed to the breaking point. She paced the porch, wringing her hands, glancing anxiously at the dense trees that seemed to mock her desperation. "Mark, Mark, where are you?" Ella's voice cracked as she called out, tears streaming down her cheeks. Each unanswered cry only deepened the void in her heart. Alex put a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Ella, you need to eat something. You won't be any help to Mark if you collapse." "I can't think about food, Alex," she snapped, her voice filled with a mix of anger and despair. "What if he's hurt? What if he's dead?" "Don't think like that," Alex urged gently. "We'll find him. We have to stay strong." Ella took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I can't lose him, Alex. I just can't." The police returned with updates, but they were few and far between. As the hours dragged on, Ella's hope waned, replaced by a gnawing fear. The officers combed the forest methodically, but the vast expanse seemed to swallow their efforts. By late afternoon, the stress was palpable. The search team took a brief break, and Ella, unable to sit still, decided to join them for the next sweep. She needed to do something, anything, to feel useful. "Please let me come with you," she begged the officer in charge, her voice shaking. "I need to find him." The officer hesitated but finally nodded. "All right, but stay close to us. It's easy to get lost out there." Ella grabbed a flashlight and followed the team into the forest. The underbrush was thick, making progress slow. Every rustle of leaves made her jump, her heart pounding in her chest. Her mind raced with terrible scenarios, each one worse than the last. "Mark, can you hear me?" she shouted, her voice echoing eerily through the trees. "Mark, please." They searched until dusk, the dim light making it harder to see. Just as they were about to turn back, a shout came from one of the officers. "Over here! I found something!" Ella's heart leapt as she ran toward the voice, Alex close behind. When she arrived, the officer was holding a torn piece of fabric. It was part of Mark's jacket. "Oh God," Ella whispered, clutching the fabric to her chest. He was here. The officer nodded. "This is a good sign. It means we're close. We'll set up a more concentrated search in this area." As they headed back to the house, Ella's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Relief that they had a lead mixed with the terror of what might have happened to Mark. She couldn't stop shaking. That night, Ella and Alex sat in the living room, the tension between them almost palpable. Ella stared at the piece of fabric, her thoughts a chaotic jumble. "I don't understand, Alex," she said, her voice breaking. "Why would he just disappear like that? It doesn't make any sense." Alex sighed, rubbing his temples. "I don't know, Ella. Maybe there's something he didn't tell you. Something we don't know." Ella's eyes filled with tears. "We were planning to have kids, Alex. He wouldn't just leave without saying anything. Something's wrong. I can feel it." As the night dragged on, Ella couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside made her heart race. She kept seeing Mark's face, hearing his voice. She couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened, something she couldn't control. The next morning, the police intensified their search in the area where the fabric was found. Ella stayed by the phone, jumping every time it rang, hoping for news. The hours passed agonizingly slowly. Finally, around noon, the door burst open and an officer walked in, his face grave. "We've found something," he said. Ella's heart pounded in her chest as she followed the officer to the site. When they arrived, she saw a figure lying on the ground, partially covered by leaves. Her breath caught in her throat. "Mark," she whispered, fear gripping her. But as she got closer, she realized it wasn't Mark. It was another man, his face bruised and swollen. He was unconscious but alive. "Who is this?" Ella asked, her voice trembling. The officer shook his head. "We don't know yet. He doesn't have any ID on him." Ella's mind raced. Who was this man, and what did he have to do with Mark's disappearance? The mystery deepened, and with it her fear and desperation grew. As they took the man to the hospital, Ella was left with more questions than answers. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the edge of discovering something terrible, something that would change everything. Back at the house, Alex tried to comfort her, but she was inconsolable. "I need to know what's going on, Alex. I need to find Mark." "We will, Ella. We'll find him," Alex said, but his voice lacked conviction. Ella spent the rest of the day in a daze, the weight of uncertainty crushing her. She knew she had to be strong, but the fear of losing Mark forever was almost too much to bear. As night fell, she stood on the porch, staring into the dark forest. Somewhere out there, Mark was waiting for her. She could feel it. And she wouldn't stop until she found him, no matter what it took. Little did she know, the truth about Mark's disappearance was more twisted and dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The morning sun cast long shadows over the dense forest as Ella paced anxiously on the porch. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions and fear, her thoughts consumed by Mark's mysterious disappearance and the strange man they had found in the woods. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than met the eye. Alex had been a constant presence by her side, offering support and comfort. But today something felt off. He seemed distracted, almost nervous, as if he was hiding something. "Alex, we need to go back to the hospital," Ella said, her voice trembling. "I need to know who that man is and what he knows about Mark." Alex hesitated, then nodded. "All right, Ella, well, go." As they drove to the hospital, Ella couldn't help but notice the tension in Alex's grip on the steering wheel. His knuckles were white and his jaw was clenched. She pushed her unease aside, focusing on finding out the truth about Mark. When they arrived at the hospital, they were led to the room where the unidentified man was being treated. He was still unconscious, hooked up to various machines. Ella's heart sank at the sight. "Do we know who he is yet?" she asked the nurse. The nurse shook her head. "No ID, no fingerprints on record. We're waiting for him to wake up so we can question him." Ella felt a surge of frustration. She was so close to answers but still so far away. She turned to Alex, who was staring intently at the man. "Alex, what do you think happened to him?" she asked. I don't know, Ella," he replied, his voice strained. "But we'll find out." Ella couldn't shake the feeling that Alex knew more than he was letting on. She watched him carefully as they left the hospital, her suspicions growing. Back at the house, Ella found it impossible to relax. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the trees outside, set her on edge. She decided to take a walk to clear her mind. As she wandered through the woods, she thought about Mark, about the life they had built together, and the future they had planned. Suddenly, she stumbled upon a small clearing she had never seen before. There, partially hidden by leaves, was a spot that looked like it had been recently disturbed. Her heart pounded in her chest as she crouched down, brushing away the debris. She found a small, blood-stained knife and a piece of fabric that matched Mark's jacket. Ella's breath caught in her throat. She knew she had found a clue, but what did it mean? She decided to confront Alex, unable to keep her suspicions at bay any longer. When she returned to the house, Alex was in the kitchen making coffee. He looked up as she entered, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Alex, I found something in the woods," Ella said, holding up the knife and fabric. "Do you know anything about this?" Alex's face paled. "Ella, where did you find those?" "In a clearing not far from here," she replied, her voice shaking. "Alex, I need you to be honest with me. What do you know about Mark's disappearance?" Alex looked away, his hands trembling. "Ella, I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me," Ella shouted, her anger boiling over. "I know you're hiding something, just tell me the truth." Alex took a deep breath, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and desperation. "Ella, I love you. I've always loved you. I couldn't stand seeing you with him, knowing he didn't treat you right." Ella's heart raced. "What did you do, Alex?" "I didn't mean for it to happen this way," Alex said, his voice breaking. "I just wanted you to be happy. I wanted us to be together." Ella felt a surge of cold fear wash over her. "What did you do to Mark?" Alex swallowed hard. "I didn't hurt him, I swear. But I had someone follow him, to scare him, to make him leave. But something went wrong." Ella's mind reeled. "The man in the hospital, he was your guy?" Alex nodded, tears streaming down his face. "He was supposed to make Mark leave, but I didn't know he would go that far. I never wanted this, Ella." Ella felt a mix of anger and betrayal. "You had no right, Alex. Mark is my husband. You had no right to interfere in our lives." I just wanted to protect you, Alex cried. I love you, Ella. I thought you loved me too. Ella's emotions were a storm of rage and sorrow. I trusted you, Alex, and you betrayed me. Just then the phone rang, breaking the tense silence. Ella answered, her hands shaking. Hello? Mrs. Thompson? This is Officer Reynolds. We need you to come to the station. We have new information about Mark. Ella felt her heart drop. I'll be there right away. She hung up and turned to Alex. I have to go. The police have news about Mark. Alex nodded, looking defeated. He'll drive you. The drive to the station was silent, the air thick with unspoken words. When they arrived, Officer Reynolds met them at the door. Mrs. Thompson, we have reason to believe that Mark may still be alive, he said. Ella felt a flicker of hope. What do you mean? We found evidence that suggests he was taken, not killed, Reynolds explained. We're following up on leads now. Ella's mind raced. She glanced at Alex, who looked both relieved and terrified. Thank you, officer, she said. Please find him. As they left the station, Ella couldn't shake the feeling that this nightmare was far from over. She needed to find Mark to bring him home. But she also knew she had to confront the truth about Alex and his role in this twisted web of deception. Back at the house, Ella and Alex sat in tense silence. Finally, Ella spoke. Alex, I need you to leave. I can't be around you right now. Alex looked devastated. Ella, please, let me help you find Mark. I owe you that much. No, Alex, Ella said firmly. You've done enough. I need to do this on my own. As Alex left, Ella felt a sense of resolve. She would find Mark no matter what it took, and when she did, she would make sure that those who had hurt him paid for their actions. Little did she know the path to finding Mark would be filled with more danger and betrayal than she could have ever imagined. Ella lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the past months over and over. She couldn't sleep, haunted by the memories of her affair with Alex and the lies she had spun to keep it hidden from Mark. The guilt gnawed at her, especially now that Mark was missing and possibly in danger. She remembered the secret meetings with Alex, the whispered conversations, and the stolen moments. Each time she had convinced herself it was just a fling, that it didn't mean anything. But it did mean something, and now the consequences were unfolding in ways she never imagined. One night after one of their meetings, she had told Alex she couldn't leave Mark. I can't do this anymore, Alex. I love Mark, and we're planning to start a family. This has to end. Alex had looked at her with a mix of disappointment and determination. I understand, Ella, but if you ever change your mind, you know where to find me. Now, as she lay in bed, Ella's phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a message from the hospital. The unidentified man had regained consciousness. She felt a surge of hope mixed with dread. Maybe he could shed light on what happened to Mark. The next morning, she rushed to the hospital, her heart pounding in her chest. Alex insisted on coming along despite the tension between them. When they arrived, the nurse led them to the man's room. He was pale and weak, but his eyes were alert. Ella and Alex approached the bed cautiously. Can you tell us what happened? Ella asked, her voice trembling. The man's gaze shifted to Alex, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. You. I know you, he rasped. Ella's heart pounded. What do you mean? John took a deep breath. Mark knew Ella was cheating. He was planning to take revenge on Alex. When he went to the forest to get a gun, we attacked him, but he escaped and one of our men stabbed him in the stomach. Ella felt like the ground had been pulled out from under her. You stabbed him? John nodded weakly. I didn't, but one of our guys did. We were supposed to scare him off, not kill him, but he fought back. Ella turned to Alex, her eyes filled with accusation. You knew about this? Alex looked horrified. No, I swear I didn't know they would go that far. John continued, his voice faltering. Mark's alive. He's hiding somewhere. He's hurt, but he's alive. Ella's heart leaped with hope and fear. Where is he? John shook his head. I don't know. He managed to escape. But he'll come for you, Alex. He knows everything. Ella felt tears streaming down her face. The man she loved was out there, wounded and alone, and it was all because of her and Alex's betrayal. She turned to Alex, her voice breaking. You have to help me find him. We have to make this right. Alex nodded, his face pale. "I will, Ella, I promise." They left the hospital in a daze, the weight of their actions pressing down on them. Back at the house, Ella tried to gather her thoughts. She knew they had to act quickly if they were going to find Mark and make amends. That night, Ella couldn't sleep. The guilt and fear were overwhelming. She kept picturing Mark, hurt and alone, plotting his revenge. She had to find him before it was too late. In the early hours of the morning, she heard a noise outside. Her heart raced as she crept to the window. There in the moonlight, she saw a figure moving through the trees. It was Mark. She rushed outside, calling his name. "Mark! Mark, please!" Mark turned, his face a mask of pain and anger. He was clutching his side, blood seeping through his shirt. "Ella, stay back," he warned, his voice cold. Ella stopped in her tracks, tears streaming down her face. "Mark, I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen." Mark's eyes were filled with rage. "You betrayed me, Ella, you and Alex both. And now you're going to pay." Ella felt a surge of fear. "Mark, please, we can fix this. We can make it right." Mark shook his head. "It's too late for that." Just then, Alex appeared holding a gun. "Mark, don't do this. Let's talk." Mark laughed bitterly. "Talk? You think talking will fix this?" Ella stepped between them, her hands raised. "Please, Mark, let's just go inside and talk. We can figure this out." Mark's eyes softened for a moment, then he nodded. "Fine, but if either of you try anything, I won't hesitate." They went inside, the tension palpable. Mark sat down, wincing in pain. "Start talking," he demanded. Ella took a deep breath. "I know we hurt you, Mark, and I'm so sorry. But I love you and I want to make this right." Mark looked at her, his eyes filled with pain. "You love me? After everything you've done?" Ella nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, Mark, I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but I love you. Please give us a chance to fix this." Mark looked at Alex. "And you? What do you have to say?" Alex lowered the gun, his face filled with regret. "I'm sorry, Mark, I never meant for any of this to happen. I love Ella and I wanted to be with her. But I see now that I was wrong." Mark sighed, the anger slowly draining from his face. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you, but for Ella's sake, I'll try." Ella felt a glimmer of hope. "Thank you, Mark. Thank you." Mark looked at her, his eyes filled with sorrow. "But things will never be the same, Ella. You broke my trust. It's going to take a long time to rebuild that." Ella nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "I know, Mark, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Mark sighed, his shoulders slumping. "All right, let's start by getting me to a hospital. I can't keep going like this." Ella and Alex helped Mark to the car, the tension still heavy but now mixed with a sense of hope. As they drove to the hospital, Ella couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way through this. But she also knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, filled with the shadows of their past mistakes. Mark's recovery was slow and painful. Every day in the hospital was a reminder of the betrayal he had endured and the vengeance he was planning. Ella visited him daily, her guilt and sorrow evident in every word and gesture. Mark accepted her apologies but remained distant, his mind fixated on what he needed to do next. Once he was discharged from the hospital, Mark went home with Ella. She tried to care for him, but he kept his emotions tightly controlled, masking his true intentions. He had a plan, and nothing would deter him from executing it. A few weeks later, late one night, Mark decided it was time to act. He gathered his strength, packed a small bag, and left a note for Ella, claiming he needed some time alone to think. She was asleep, unaware of his departure. Mark made his way to Alex's house, his mind racing with thoughts of retribution. He knew Alex would never expect him to strike back, especially after what he had already endured. As he approached the house, he took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. The house was dark and quiet, a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing inside Mark. He crept around the back, finding an unlocked window. With careful precision, he climbed inside, making his way through the house without a sound. He found Alex asleep in his bedroom, completely unaware of the danger lurking just feet away. Mark stood over him, watching him sleep, his anger bubbling to the surface. He thought about the man in the hospital, the one who had admitted to attacking him. It was time for Alex to experience the same fear and pain. Mark reached into his bag and pulled out a knife, the cold metal reflecting the moonlight filtering through the window. He moved silently, his heart pounding in his chest. As he approached the bed, Alex stirred, his eyes fluttering open. Before Alex could react, Mark grabbed him, pressing the knife to his throat. "Not a sound," Mark whispered, his voice cold and menacing. Alex's eyes widened in terror. "Mark, what are you doing? Please don't do this." Mark tightened his grip, his voice low and filled with rage. "This is for everything you've done, for the betrayal, for the pain, for thinking you could take everything from me." He dragged Alex out of bed, forcing him to the floor. Alex struggled, but Mark's strength and determination were overpowering. Mark tied him up, just as he had been tied up in the forest, the memories fueling his actions. "Do you know what it's like to be left for dead?" Mark hissed. "To feel the life draining out of you while your enemies watch." Alex shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "Please, Mark, I'm sorry, I never meant for this to happen." Mark laughed bitterly. "You never meant for this to happen? You hired people to kill me, Alex, and now you're going to pay." With calculated precision, Mark inflicted the same wounds on Alex that he had endured. The pain, the fear, the helplessness. He made sure Alex felt it all. Alex's screams filled the room, but Mark remained cold and detached, his actions driven by the need for revenge. When Mark was done, he stood over Alex, his breathing heavy. Alex lay on the floor, bloodied and broken, his eyes filled with fear and regret. Mark leaned in close, his voice a deadly whisper. "Remember this, Alex. Remember what happens when you betray someone. This is your punishment." Mark left the house, leaving Alex to suffer the consequences of his actions. As he walked away, he felt a sense of grim satisfaction. He had avenged himself, but he also knew that this act of violence would leave a permanent mark on his soul. Returning home, Mark found Ella waiting for him, worry etched on her face. She rushed to him, relief flooding her eyes. "Mark, where have you been? I was so scared." Mark looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I needed to take care of something." Ella sensed the change in him, the darkness that now lingered in his eyes. She didn't ask any more questions, knowing that whatever had happened, it was something she could never fully understand. In the days that followed, news spread about the brutal attack on Alex. The police were baffled, unable to find any leads or evidence. Ella watched the news in silence, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what Mark had done. Mark, on the other hand, remained stoic, his emotions buried deep. He knew that he could never undo what had been done, but he also knew that he had to live with the choices he had made. The path of revenge had been a dark one, and it had changed him forever. As he lay in bed one night, Ella sleeping peacefully beside him, Mark stared at the ceiling, the events of the past few months replaying in his mind. He had lost so much, but he had also gained a sense of closure. Alex had paid for his betrayal, and now it was time for Mark to try and rebuild his life. But deep down he knew that the scars of what had happened would never fully heal. The memories would always be there, a reminder of the darkness that had consumed him. And as he closed his eyes, he wondered if he would ever truly find peace. The days following Mark's brutal attack on Alex were a blur. Ella sensed the tension and the change in Mark, but she never imagined the depths of his actions. The news of Alex's condition spread quickly, and the police launched an immediate investigation. It wasn't long before Alex regained consciousness and revealed everything to the authorities. Mark's arrest came swiftly. The police arrived at their home early one morning, their voices stern and their demeanor unyielding. Mark offered no resistance. He knew this moment was inevitable. As they handcuffed him and led him out of the house, he glanced back at Ella, who stood in the doorway, her face pale with shock and fear. "Mark, what did you do?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. He couldn't meet her eyes. "I'm sorry, Ella, I had to do it." The police car sped away, leaving Ella standing alone, her mind reeling from the revelation. Mark was taken to the police station, where he was interrogated for hours. Despite his initial defiance, the evidence was overwhelming, and he eventually confessed to the attack. During his trial, Mark remained stoic, his face a mask of determination. Ella attended every session, her heart breaking with each passing day. She listened as the details of his actions were laid bare, the horror of what he had done becoming all too real. Alex testified against Mark, describing the fear and pain he had endured. His voice shook with emotion, but his words were clear. "Mark attacked me. He wanted revenge. I thought I was going to die." When the verdict was delivered, Mark felt a mix of relief and despair. He had known from the beginning that there was no escaping the consequences of his actions. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, his future now confined to the walls of a cell. The day of his transfer to prison was filled with a heavy silence. Ella visited him one last time before he was taken away. They sat across from each other, separated by a thick pane of glass. The pain in her eyes was almost too much for Mark to bear. "Mark, why did you do it?" she asked, her voice trembling. He sighed, struggling to find the words. "I couldn't let him get away with what he did to us, Ella. He tried to kill me. He took everything from me." She shook her head, tears falling freely. "But you lost yourself in the process. We could have found another way." Mark reached out, placing his hand against the glass. "I'm sorry, Ella, for everything. I never meant to hurt you." Ella pressed her hand to the glass, mirroring his gesture. "I know, Mark. I know." As he was led away, Mark felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. The journey to the prison was long and silent, the reality of his new life settling in with each passing mile. When they arrived, he was processed and escorted to his cell, the clang of the metal door echoing through the corridor. The days in prison were monotonous and cold. Mark kept to himself, his mind constantly replaying the events that had led him there. The guilt and regret gnawed at him, but he also felt a grim sense of justice. Alex had paid for his betrayal, just as Mark was now paying for his own actions. One night, as Mark lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling, he heard the guards escorting a new inmate into the cell block. The voices were hushed, but he could make out snippets of conversation. His heart raced as he recognized Alex's name. Alex had been transferred to the same prison, a twist of fate that neither of them had expected. The next morning, during the brief recreation period, Mark saw Alex across the yard. Their eyes met, and the tension between them was palpable. Mark approached, his anger simmering just below the surface. "You think this is over, Alex? You think you can escape what you did?" Alex looked weary but resolute. "I never wanted it to come to this, Mark, but you left me no choice." Mark's fists clenched, but he forced himself to remain calm. "You betrayed me, Alex. You and Ella both. And now look where we are." Alex's expression softened. "I know I made mistakes, we all did. But this cycle of revenge has to end, Mark. It has to stop." Mark felt a surge of conflicting emotions. He wanted to lash out, to make Alex pay again. But a part of him also knew that Alex was right. The hatred and violence had consumed them both, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. As the guards called them back to their cells, Mark took one last look at Alex. "This isn't over, Alex. You will regret this." Alex nodded, understanding the depth of Mark's anger. "I already do, Mark. I already do." Back in his cell, Mark lay on his bunk, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. He had lost everything: his freedom, his family, and his sense of self. The walls of the prison closed in around him, a constant reminder of the choices he had made. As the days turned into weeks and months, Mark found himself reflecting on his life. He thought about Ella, about their dreams and plans, and about the betrayal that had shattered everything. He realized that he had let his anger and desire for revenge consume him, leading him down a path of darkness and regret. In the quiet of his cell, Mark vowed to find a way to atone for his actions. He didn't know how or when, but he knew he had to try. The journey ahead would be long and difficult, but he was determined to find some semblance of redemption. The end of Mark's story was not the one he had envisioned. It was filled with pain, betrayal, and loss. But it was also a story of realization and the potential for change. As he stared at the cold gray walls of his cell, he hoped that one day he could find a way to make things right.